Now the mixing method that we are going to be using to make our chocolate chip cookies is called the creaming method. Now this is the most common mixing method used for chocolate chip cookies as well as many other cookie recipes. So the reason it is called the creaming method is because the first step of this mixing method is to cream our butter and sugar together. So I have some unsalted butter here that I have had sitting out at room temperature for at least an hour, and the texture of this butter is soft, but it is still solid. So you can see that it's definitely a soft texture here, but you don't want your butter melting because that's going to make it very difficult to properly cream your butter and sugar together. So I'm going to go ahead and add this into our mixing bowl here. And I'm using unsalted butter for my cookies here because I like to control the amount of salt that goes into my cookies. So I always recommend unsalted butter for baking. Now to my mixing bowl here, I'm also adding brown sugar and granulated sugar. And brown sugar has molasses in it, which is going to add a lot of chewiness to our cookies and help retain more moisture. Now the granulated sugar is going to help us achieve a little bit of crispiness to our cookies. So now we just want to cream our butter and sugars together until they are really light and fluffy. Now what happens when you cream butter and sugar together is we are forcing air to get trapped in between a web of sugars and fats. And what that's going to do is it's going to lighten the texture of our cookies, and it's going to help leaven them, and it actually helps increase the volume of our cookie dough, which equals more cookies. So if you actually don't cream your butter and sugar together well, you could end up with 1 or 2 less cookies out of your dough, which nobody wants that. So you always want to make sure that you're creaming this together properly. So I'm going to turn the mixer on medium-high speed, and I'm going to let it cream for about 5 minutes. Now I know that seems like a long time, but you do want to get quite a lot of volume added into this mixture. And about halfway through, I'm going to stop the mixer and scrape down the bowl to make sure it's all getting incorporated. Now when you scrape down the mixing bowl, you want to make sure you're getting all the way to the bottom of the bowl to really scrape up all of the butter and sugar off the bottom and make sure that it's getting well creamed together. So my butter and sugar mixture is finished being creamed here. You can see that it has really lightened in color and texture. And now I'm just going to scrape down the bowl, and then we can move on to adding our next ingredients. So the next ingredient that I'm going to add here is some vanilla extract. Now vanilla is only serving the purpose to flavor our cookie dough, and I use quite a lot of vanilla in my chocolate chip cookies because I really love the flavor, but you actually could leave it out completely or use a little bit less if you prefer. Now the next thing that we're going to be adding into our cookie dough is our eggs. Now these have also been sitting out at room temperature. I pulled them out of the refrigerator at the same time that I pulled the butter out of the refrigerator, and that just helps them absorb into our dough more easily. So I'm actually going to add the eggs one at a time, and once the egg is absorbed into the dough, then I will add the next one. And we're only going to mix just until the eggs are incorporated. You don't want to mix for a long time like we did with our butter and sugar because we're not trying to incorporate air into the eggs. We just want them to absorb into our dough. Now the reason that we add these one at a time is that if you do add eggs too quickly into your dough or batter, you're risking breaking that web of air that we beat into our butter and sugar, and we don't want to do that. So adding them one at a time ensures that they'll absorb into the mixture without breaking the emulsion that we have created. And just continually scrape down the bowl as you're making your dough. This just ensures that everything is really getting evenly combined. So now that our eggs are combined into our dough, we can go ahead and move on to our dry ingredients. Now, a lot of recipes do call for combining all of your dry ingredients into your flour before adding them into your dough. Now, I actually prefer adding my baking soda, baking powder, and salt before adding my flour because I find that it just distributes a little more evenly throughout the dough. So this dough is going to be using two different chemical leavening agents, and those are baking soda and baking powder. Now, these are going to help tenderize our cookie, help them rise, and also help with the browning of our cookie. Now, baking soda is an alkaline substance, which means it needs an acidic component to interact with in order to activate. So the brown sugar in our dough is going to activate our baking soda. Now, baking powder can be used all on its own without needing an acidic component to interact with, so it's going to help with the leavening along with the baking soda. So we can go ahead and add those into our dough. And then we're also going to be adding salt. Now, salt is such an important ingredient in any baking recipe because it's just going to round out the flavors. If you make any kind of baked good and don't put salt in it, it's going to taste really flat and overly sweet. So salt is so important, and I never recommend leaving it out of any recipe. So now we'll just go ahead and mix these until they're just combined. So now we can go ahead and add in our flour into our dough, which is going to be the main structure of our cookie. Now, I want to mix as little as possible once I add my flour in, because what's going to happen is the flour is going to start creating gluten once it starts getting hydrated and mixed. And we don't want to overdevelop that gluten because that's going to lead to a really tough cookie. So I'm actually just going to mix this until it's almost combined and not completely combined, and then I'm going to add my chocolate chips and then I'll finish the mixing. Okay, so you can see now that that flour is almost completely combined, but there's still a little bit more mixing that needs to be done. So now I'm going to add my chocolate chips. And I'm actually going to hold a few chips back, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with those here in a minute. And now I can finish combining the chocolate chips, which will also mix in the rest of the flour. And that's it. That is our chocolate chip cookie dough. Okay, so now we can go ahead and start scooping our cookie dough and bake it. Now, I am using a cookie scoop that is about 3 tablespoons in volume, and this makes pretty large cookies. Now, I really like this size because it's going to give us a cookie that has all of those contrasts of texture. It'll have a really chewy center and a really crispy outer edges, so I like making large cookies, but you can use a smaller scoop if you prefer that. Now, if you are going to be making large cookies, I suggest only putting 6 per cookie sheet. Now, that's going to give them the ability to spread out and cook evenly. If you really overcrowd your pan, you can have cookies that don't cook very evenly, and they're all going to start kind of melting together as they cook in the oven. So I'm going to do 6 on my baking sheet here. Now, before I put these in the oven, I like to do a couple finishing touches that just really makes these look really pretty and taste amazing. And that is to add a few chocolate chips to the top of each one, and also to sprinkle each one with a little bit of salt. Now, I really like the contrast of sweet and savory with all of my baked goods, so that salt is really going to take these over the top, but that's a completely optional step. Now, adding the chocolate chips to the top of the cookies is going to give you those really picture-perfect cookies where you can see all of the chocolate oozing out the top. Okay, and now I'm just going to sprinkle just a little bit of coarse salt over the top of each of these cookies, and then we'll go ahead and bake them. Now, instead of baking all of the cookies at once, I actually like to scoop the cookies out and put them in a Tupperware container in the refrigerator. This way, when I want more fresh cookies, they're already all ready to go, and I can bake some more. Now, this dough is actually going to improve in flavor and texture the longer it sits in the refrigerator, You can let it be in the refrigerator for up to 3 days, and that 3-day time is really ideal. It's going to let the cookies really develop in flavor, and I think you'll notice quite a bit of a difference in the texture of them. So if you've never let your cookie dough rest in the refrigerator, definitely try it sometime. So I just pulled the cookies out of the oven, and I don't know if you can tell in the video here, but you want to pull them out when they still look slightly underdone in the centers. That is going to give you the best texture for your cookie because they're going to continue cooking a little bit here on your baking sheet. Now I like to leave them on the baking sheet for about 5 minutes, and then you can go ahead and just devour them warm or move them onto a cooling rack to cool completely. So I'm gonna let these cool slightly and then we will dig into one. So I've let the cookies cool for about 5 minutes and then I transferred them onto the cooling rack here. And now I want to dig into one. So I think this one looks really good. Let's go ahead and break it open and see how it looks on the inside. Oh, you can tell that it has a chewy texture in the center and there's some crispness to the edges. And now I have to taste it. They're perfect. I love these cookies so much. They're such a simple recipe, but all of those tricks that I showed you about creaming the butter and sugar for a long time and not rushing it, and then adding our eggs in one at a time and not over mixing the dough once our flour is added is going to give you such a perfect texture to your cookie. So I hope you feel a little more confident now in the creaming method for making cookies. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section and I will be happy to answer them. If you aren't already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss any videos. And you can follow me at Baker Bettie on Instagram and on Facebook. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.